You're watching Time and Tide, because watches aren't boring.
Welcome back to Watch and Chill. This is a special episode. This is the Audemars Piguet Beyond History Special Edition on Watch and Chill. 2 episodes. Episode 1 is all about the way the past resonates in the present, especially through the Remaster 01 Selfwinding Chronograph. So go back and check that one out if you haven't seen it. And this one is all about the present and the way we're rolling at great pace into the future. I have 2 very special guests with me. Once again, Michael Friedman, the head of complications at Audemars Piguet, and collector extraordinaire and all-round good guy, Eric Koo. Hi, Eric. Eric's coming to us from California, and Michael in La Brassou. So we are, and I'm in Australia. So we are well globally placed to take things over here, gents.
We're stretching the globe, man.
We are using technology to its full degree. And we are in this very strange 2020 year. How are you both, gentlemen? And how are you coping with the year so far?
Eric, you first.
A lot of Netflix.
I have a 1-year-old at home, so a lot of baby time, although grandma back in the US is not happy about the situation at all. I think if my mother could single-handedly end the COVID crisis just to see her granddaughter, she would go to hell and back to make that happen. So, but like everyone else, it's extremely difficult being apart from family, friends, loved ones, but we're also being as optimistic as we can and moving forward and forging ahead. And passionate pursuits like what we're up to today is a great vehicle to take a little break from the chaos in the news and to talk about something different.
Well, we are staying connected, and look, ironically, this is the closest I've ever been to both of you. So you know, we're making headway in terms of keeping friendships alive. I have explained how I know you both in episode 1, so go back and check that out. But we talked about in episode 1 how collectors like Eric can play a very active role in shaping the future, as Eric did with the Remaster 01 Selfwinding Chronograph. However, today, I believe there are some announcements for the Zoom team and everyone watching that haven't involved Eric as intimately as they did in the Remaster 01. So, Michael, do you want to tell us what we have in store today and, set the scene here?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So absolutely, for Remaster 01, Eric was one of our close friends who was able to review some early renderings, give some great feedback, some great encouragement, and indeed helped inspire us that we were moving in the right direction and that there would indeed be a great reaction to many on a project like that. But we're always, we have that side of Audemars Piguet where we talk about our finishing techniques, we talk about the more historical elements and the roots, but as those who follow our new creations, we also have many watches that are very much on the pulse. We really are looking ahead. We're looking to anticipate. We really want to make watches of the moment and of tomorrow. It's very important for us, again, as we mentioned in the first part, to leave our mark each generation and to make sure in 30, 40, 50, 70 years, when people look back on watches made now, that the watches we create at Audemars Piguet are very much evocative of this era and of this time and where things are headed. This has been, I would say, most realized in our lifetimes with the introduction of the concept back in 2002, the first Audemars Piguet concept, which long before I joined Audemars Piguet, we would do talks and collector group presentations about what the concept represented to the industry at large. I remember when it came out, it was very interesting because Audemars Piguet simultaneously was working on the equation of time sunrise sunset, which is as classical as you can imagine, and reimagining a very historic horological complication for wristwatches. Then the concept. These came out not very far apart. Speaks a lot to the dynamic approach of our now CEO Francois to be pushing projects in those different directions, and that ethos has continued. But what the concept did was it unapologetically embraced futurism. It basically looked at, in a way you can look at it, a touch of remix culture, a touch of postmodern culture, that idea of breaking down the traditional barriers between case, movement, and dial to recreate, instead of recreate I would say, to create a horological expression through watchmaking that hadn't been done before. And there's definitely a before and after. A lot of the independence that we see today, a lot of that encouragement, a lot of that excitement, a lot of that direction that things went in, Concept is definitely one of those origin points. It was the first time high horology embraced almost a science fiction kind of element in watchmaking. It's been a very, very great success for us in that sense. Yes, it's high complications, not many are made, but the Concept went on to become the platform for many new movements and introductions, including the lap timer Schumacher, which was taking the idea of a digital lap timer on the request of Michael Schumacher and reverse engineering it into a horological device requiring 3 column wheels. And those of you who don't know about the lap timer, look it up. It's not a split-second chronograph. It is really a true lap timer. Fascinating complication. And then, of course, Concept also debuted Supersonore in more recent years, which is now on many of our other watches. So one of the pieces that we're looking at today is the latest entry into the Concept GMT family. It's not a new movement. It's an animation of an existing movement.
So that's a great preamble. Are we going to drop this on Eric or what?
Let's do it. Let's see it.
Let's share screen. There it is. There it is.
There it is.
There we have our new 26589 IO, our titanium GMT Concept with these blue elements that have been woven into the movement through this beautiful finishing techniques. It's an evolution of the black version that we introduced last year, which will be discontinued. That watch is being phased out while this new blue version is being phased in. It's an important part of the Concept watches. We never will overproduce any individual concept. The largest number of any of these models hit was 250 pieces. Most concepts are produced in far fewer numbers. So we wanted to approach this with the blue details, with the very light case, giving a little bit more color and a little more life to this product. What do you think, Eric? What's your reaction on that one?
I mean, I think the blue goes really well with the dark color of the titanium case. I find myself lately kind of gravitating sometimes towards watches with some kind of like blue design elements. So this is quite nice. I always loved like the design language of I'm not that well versed with the the concepts, the more modern concepts of the offshores, but you guys did like an anniversary offshore a couple years ago that kind of introduced these angular design elements in the dial layout, and it was something that I thought was like a very successful thing, and it looked very nice.
Yeah. That's right. I'm glad you mentioned that. We talked in part 1 about architecture and Bjarke and the new museum, and architecture is definitely on our mind a lot. And it doesn't mean we're borrowing directly from architecture, but that approach to looking at angles and edges, we've always done that in watchmaking, but the approach with this type of design is to take a more architectural approach and to leave some of those more traditional shapes, yet still maintaining all of those hand finish elements.
And Michael, tell me, we're looking at this, it's a render. How does it feel? How does it wear? Are there any particular sort of tactile points that people are going to be surprised by or impressed by?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, these Concept watches are, of course, large. This version is 44 millimeter. It's a watch for a very specific wrist. Someone who either who's already large to begin with, or somebody who wants a great wrist presence of a watch. You definitely are announcing when you have a Concept on, unapologetically. You are announcing that you have very much a performance high-end watch on your wrist. However, it's incredibly light due to the titanium case, number 1. Number 2, it achieves that play of light that we spoke about earlier, like we work on all of our watches. That idea, what I mean by that is the hand finishing of all the different edges and angles are done consciously. So as you look at the watch from different angles, your eye is drawn towards those finishing techniques. So on the one hand, you're looking at something quite futuristic, but you're looking at something that's also been derived through very traditional and classic means. That's the important element for us on those pieces. The tourbillon set over there at 9 o'clock is very much a signature of many of the Concept watches, and you can see right through that tourbillon. And then you have the selection for the GMT at 3 o'clock. You have the setting to set the watch or to keep it in neutral setting at 6 o'clock, and then of course the AP up there at 12. So we really want to look at a piece that embraces futurism, light, color, but can feel, it can appear as a big presence watch, but feels very, very light on the wrist. That's a big part of our approach on these concept watches.
I mean, getting back to the, sorry, I was just going to interject here for a second. Like getting back to the discussion of like the importance of the original concept watch and the design. I mean, in my eyes, 100% like what I would call 21st century watchmaking started with that watch. It introduced like a whole new design language in watchmaking, in watches. And, you know, there's other watches that have since, you know, come on to the market that emulate certain aspects of that design. But to me, really, like, that was like a really bold statement, like a shot across the bow that was like, this is the new design language of the new type of watchmaking, the new complication, whatever. And, you know, it was really like, in my mind, it's like pre-concept and like post. I mean, you could literally draw this line and say that this really changed a lot of what modern watchmaking has become, you know?
Absolutely. And it wasn't exactly an easy rollout back in '02. It was controversial in its time. I mean, that is part of the AP story. It's not just the 72 Royal Oak that everyone knows the story about how that was initially received, the 93 Offshore, and this watch as well. The 2002 concept was very hard for the baby boomer generation, who at the time were the principal buyers of high-end watchmaking. At even just a short 20 years ago, you didn't have such a wide scope of a demographic actively buying new watches. There weren't as near as many under 35 buying high-end watches. So those who were in the position to buy did not understand where Audemars Piguet was heading. What was really exciting was that was the beginning for us of being attractive towards a younger demographic, not just young at age, but young at heart as well. And if you think back in '02 of what's happening in broader culture as well, just as 72 and 93 with those releases were responding to a broader cultural dialogue, 2002, just post the millennium, was also a very thrilling, exciting time where technology was moving faster than ever before. People were embracing technology. Companies became cool. You know, that was the era when Apple became super cool. And when you start to sort of embrace these new objects and new approaches in a more exciting way, science fiction became far more mainstream. It was no longer the province, just, again, we're back to that sort of nerd discussion, the revenge of the nerds in a way. It really came alive during that era as well. So a lot of that's happening in broader culture, which resulted in Audemars Piguet creating, and this was long before I joined the company. I was at Christie's at the time, looking after the watch department and clock department out of Christie's, New York. But I remember distinctly when this watch came out because it was very divisive generationally. Yeah, there were some older people who were a little cooler and more hip who were into it right away, but there was also a lot of doubt and curiosity about it. But young people gravitated towards it. And a short 10 years later, as Eric just said, by 2012, you end up with a very, very different space in high-end watchmaking. Now in 2020, you can look at the really incredible scope of creations. So it's materials, yes, it's design, yes, but it's also about the engineer. It's also about the technician. What I mean by that, CAD and CNC. They are a huge presence in the field of watchmaking across the entire industry. The question is, to what extent is it utilized and how it's utilized? Audemars Piguet started the journey with CAD and CNC way back in 1986 with the world's first self-winding tourbillon. Eric, you know the one I'm referring to. That automatic tourbillon, which was the first time a tourbillon in series was produced, first time a self-winding tourbillon, and most importantly, the tourbillon appeared on the dial for the first time in a production watch. That was the first time Audemars Piguet created a product where the traditional watchmaker was very much working on creation that had already gone through a CAD, computer assisted design, and CNC, computer numerical control, pre-production process where the elements and components, some of them could not have been made through traditional means. So we had already been quite a long way along that journey by the time O2 arrives with the concept. I mention that because, again, you have these different channels at AP where you have the very traditional, the very classic, but you also have these channels where we really are looking to push and push and push. I feel that this GMT Blue is starting, again, it's representing that again through a more modern lens. Back to your question, Andrew, the user interface is a big part of the concept. We want the pushers, the buttons, the crowns, the selectors, we want them to feel incredibly modern and incredibly contemporary. We want it to, again, evoke technology in a very subtle way, not in an entire way, but we want to sort of feel again of the moment. How will this watch be interpreted in the future? It's very easy for us to look back at vintage watches. Me and you and Eric, we could quickly look at vintage watches and be pretty close. That's from the 20s, that's from the 40s, that's from the 60s. When you look at watchmaking the last 20 years, was that going to be as easy to determine in the future? Are companies in general creating of the moment? Some yes, some no, some in the middle. But again, we're conscious of that bigger timeline effect and that notion of creating an object that will be relevant not just now, but also into the decades to come.
Can I just make a really, there's an elephant in the room for me when I look at this watch. When I look at a concept, can I, and I want you to both agree with me. I want to get that contract before I say this. How old does this make you feel? Because when I saw the first concept in 2002, that was 18 years ago. It's
right.
Like, you know, when we go back to music, OK Computer is like 25 years old or something.
I make the same reference, Andrew, to the same album.
What the hell? This is 18 years ago, and I
look at the Nirvana kid. You know, like they just did an article about that again. The guy's like 32 or something now. I don't know.
Exactly, he was 10 when it came out. No,
yeah.
This is so. That's the first. Whenever I see a concept, I'm like, oh man, this is this cool new. What? Cool, this ain't new anymore. This is old enough to drink a beer with me in Australia. But I also wanted to make the point because you talk about this being, you know, it's ageless and timeless and epochless in a way. But I also, when I did the recent Tokyo exhibition, I was fortunate that we could travel at that time, which seems novel now. But when we connected at that event, and I did that historical walk around, and it gets to 2002 in the timeline, and it's just bam, you know, it's like this lightning bolt. Literally, it looks like it's been formed partly by a lightning bolt. But it's just so. And the point is, I think that the achievement of that first model is just so epic because it's just standing out on that timeline and the way that it, you know, obviously, you know, however 18 years later, we see a lot of those codes are continuing and they're slightly evolving, but it was really all about that first model. And I have to say that the achievement is so intensely shown in stark relief when you see a timeline of AP models, and then this one just appears in 2002. So they're the two things I wanted to say. One, how old we feel, and two, how startling this model was in the timeline when you look at it side by side, you know?
I mean, new interpretations of design language are kind of like difficult to digest when they come out. But one comment that I'd make is I feel that the original concept, now you keep saying it's 18 years old, right? The watch has aged so well. Like, I mean, I look at it now and it's still like kind of like this breath of fresh air. It's just a really beautiful piece, you know?
No one's gone down this path. Like often there'll be something game changing and then there'll be it's a code that's more common now, but still it didn't exactly create it's obviously a very hard path to follow, I think is what we can say about it.
Yeah. No, but I mean, it's aged very well, and it's still one of my favorite kind of modern watches.
I think that era was very fertile. You referred to OK Computer, and I think that late 90s, early 2000s, that yes, and we are getting older, Andrew and Eric, it's a little frightening, and it's I remember people our age back then speaking about I know it's, you know, and but that goes back to also the point of leaving our mark, you know, and And it's not to be a cliche, it doesn't necessarily go by fast. It depends on how you look at the timeline. So you can look at your own timeline. Some memories feel like yesterday, and some really feel like a long effing time ago. You know, that's the neurology of time travel. Our brain doesn't process time evenly. This is why a memory from your childhood could feel like yesterday, whereas you can remember a meal your grandmother served you, but you can't tell me what you ate 3 days ago for dinner. Our brain really doesn't care about the timeline in the way that our conscious mind does. But back to the initial point on what's happening there, late 90s, early 2000s, it's very experimental. There's a lot changing and shifting. I touched upon it earlier about the emerging popularity of technology, what that gave to music, what that gave to video games, what that gave to film. Special effects is what I'm talking about. This incorporation of technologies into long existing fields to advance and move mediums in very creative ways. So you mentioned OK Computer. That record could not have been made 10 years before. It's just a fact, and not the way it was crafted or made. Same thing with the concept. It could not have been made 10 years before. Simply utilizing that alacrite, the machine, all of those elements couldn't have been done before. It's taking advantage of that era, of the now, to create something new and different. I also mentioned video games and film, just to keep in mind the huge step that took place with special effects in movies during that same era, as well as the big advancement with video games that took place as we moved from the bit wars, the 8-bit, 1632-bit, into real digital video gaming experiences, which we're very much are tied to still today. So yeah, and this conversation happens in all of those different mediums as well. Can you believe X is 18, 20 years old? That is really exciting for me, because we're back to that notion of we're looking at works of culture that can cut through the timeline. And that's what excites all of us. You don't always know if it's going to work or resonate. Sometimes things will disappear and then reappear. You know, in car collecting culture 18 years ago, it was a joke to talk about a Ferrari Dino. My generation loved the Dino for the hard line edges and the aggressive design. But the older generation 20 years ago was saying, Friedman, that's a 6-cylinder, man. That's not a real Ferrari. You don't know what you're talking about. You're a kid, you know. But our generation is now there. And what's happened, the Dino has become the icon, because it wasn't just me. It was all of us born in those late 60s through the mid 80s that all fell in love with a lot of those same angles and edges that went on to define angles and edges. You see where I'm getting at here? It's
that like 30-year cycle thing that people are talking about too, and the nostalgia factor, things that we created at a certain moment in time, and then now it's like, oh man, that was like, you know, that was a cool thing.
The 30-year cycle is extremely real, and it's getting more and more real as we can have the tools to reflect on history in a much deeper way. Absolutely. The 30-year cycle is very much alive, and you can look at so many different elements of collecting to find that and to determine that.
There's a lot of weird cars of the early 1990s that are like super collectible right now.
Oh yeah, last time I was in Hong Kong, I kept seeing these like incredibly well-preserved late 80s, early 90s cars. And I asked a friend of mine, what's going on here? And he's like, generations moving on, man. Like they're capturing their youth.
I was laughing like on a car auction site. There was like a Honda Prelude from 1989 with 7,000 miles on it. This is a car that would have been scrapped like 10 years ago. It sold for like $47,000. That's insane, you know?
I was just listening to a podcast where Gary Vaynerchuk was talking about how he wants to buy Friendster or MySpace just so he can have the licensing for T-shirts, because he thinks the cycle creates this.
ICQ was the first like online messaging platform that I remember, and then it became like, and then there was AOL Instant Messenger. Yeah, Friendster, man. I mean, I remember a Friendster.
Buy a T-shirt, 100%.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. That's a really good idea. Yeah, I love that. It's true. Things move quickly, and yeah, the time has passed, but it did create. And it was planting a new seed for us. It took a little bit of time to grow. And like the 72 Royal Oak and the 93 Offshore, it took a while to evolve, but it has evolved, and it's now really become a platform for us to go more experimental. It allows us to be a little untethered. It allows us to really get creative, for the watchmakers, the technicians, the engineers And you should even, on the R&D side, things that don't make it into production, some of that stuff is just absolutely wild and incredible, let alone what does. And the concept journey is very much ongoing. I can assure you that the new chapters will keep coming. As you've seen in recent years, there's been chapters. Just recently, Eric and I actually just spoke about the new woman's concept that we just released.
Love it.
Yeah, it's that was the first. It's a 38.5, so it's smaller, frosted gold with a beautiful layer dial.
Yeah.
Now we're to the conversation of case dimension, which we hit upon a little bit on the remaster. But case dimension is something at Audemars Piguet to dive into. You have to look at the whole picture of not just the form language, but also the movement development. We simultaneously, consciously work from the ultra thin to the thick, because each case is its own frame and different things are possible within that context. So the same year that we're doing an ultra thin perpetual calendar, the RD2, which I think I can out you, Eric, that's also in your collection, the thinnest ultra thin self-winding perpetual calendar. The same year we're doing that, we're developing this very large pronounced concepts as well as these code complications right in between. But what you'll find is these different case architectures give a different platform for the movement creators. Let's look at open working alone for a second. Ultra thin open working is beautiful, but it's harder to tell machine finishing from hand finishing when it's ultra flat. We will do more ultra flat open working in the future, but look what happened when we released 15407, the double balance wheel. It was a renaissance for open working, not just at AP, but for the industry. Why did that watch galvanize collectors in a way, and press and enthusiasts in a way that other open work watches didn't? It was the fact that it had thickness to it, because the thickness allows you to see all the angles and all the edges and all that play of light. Again, you don't have to care about that stuff to appreciate that stuff. You don't have to be a gemologist to look at a beautiful stone. You can look at a beautiful stone and recognize it for what it is. You don't have to be an art historian to look at a Basquiat and fall in love with it. You can just have that reaction to it. And that's the approach to watch design here, is that you have different canvases, ultra thin, medium, large, really large. Eric mentioned the 25th anniversary Offshore. That watch was gigantically thick, but it was so architectural in design nature, we chose to make it that thick. And Eric, you might remember the crystal for that watch actually goes over the screws. It's kind of crazy. All of that was a conscious design effort to, again, play with form, language, and architecture in a different way. I mentioned that because it's going to tie to the next one a little bit, Andrew.
It is. There's a perfect segue there, but I just want to indulge myself and everyone watching just a little bit more on this model. So, because all we can see right now is the front profile, and I just want to get out a little, because I don't have any details. I have no more information than what you're looking at too, dear viewer. So the lug to lug on this looks pretty extreme. What are we talking about? Are we over 50?
The lug to lug, if you go, yeah, you're approaching there. But it has a curvature to it. It has if you put the concept on, you will feel there's an ergonomic element to the design of it. Again, if you're a very smaller profile person, it's not necessarily going to be a watch that you're going to be able to put on and feel right at ease with. I'm right at the edge of them myself, and I really enjoy wearing them, but I'm definitely aware that there's something there on my wrist. We're, of course, exploring, is it possible to do these concepts in smaller sizes as well? And as we've released the women's watches recently, multiple versions now, clearly it is. So that's definitely a path that we're opening up as well. But when you're introducing these new movements and showcasing this architecture, especially when you consider the Super Sonore or the Lap Timer or these very multi-layer GMT watches, the case profile is what gives you the ability to do that type of work in finishing. It's the difference between an artist who will do a small size work and a really large scale work. You get different details and different approaches and different elements when you play with size in a different way. It doesn't mean it's for everybody. And let me be clear, that's perfectly okay. A great thing about watches is how personal it is. If you love something a company does and you dislike something a company does, that's great. I think what we're excited for in the watch industry is it's like it's going to be great when we get to a point where people can see the craft and to bring the eyes on the talents that go into the creation of the watch. So we end, more parallel conversations of what someone's subjective experiences with the watch and what is objectively observed about the watch. And that's something I always, when I see a new creation from any brand or any company, my first investigation into that watch is what went into it, how was it approached, why were these choices made. I want to get into the head of the people who worked on the piece so I can understand it and then appreciate it in a different way when I have the piece on. And it is a real exciting time for modern watch production. The scope of offerings is amazing, and really interesting designs, approaches, and a very, let's say it's the most liberated time in watchmaking history because of the tools we have, the ability to have very small manufacturers, small batches of watches, and the creativity is alive. If you look at Eric's Instagram himself, you'll see in his collection quite a wide scope of form language from several different companies ranging several different decades, including quite a few interesting pieces that are more contemporary. Not just from AP, by the way, from referring to many other brands.
Now, the other side of the watch, what do we see on the caseback?
So on the caseback, that's a great question, because each family of watch, you take a different approach with finishing techniques. So the concept is a piece where the finishing techniques always also need to have a very futuristic and very contemporary element. So you see these beautiful coatings on the movement that give it a very fresh, very modern look. The blue theme carries around the theme of those shards that you see on the front, those sort of architectural elements. You're going to see that also echoed on the reverse of the watch. So yes, the notion is to turn the watch around, to really enjoy it, each element of it, and that sort of, again, that architectural 360-degree experience. You have to create something that looks and can be experiential from all different angles and all different levels. If you create a watch just so it can look good on a soldier shot for a campaign, that's not achieving very much. We fall in love with watches at any price point, from any maker, from any manufacturer, when we're able to look and discover. The watch that's on your wrist, and you're looking at it dozens and dozens and dozens of times a day. So this is where the importance of form and materials comes into play. Look at, for example, just to jump on the other end of the spectrum, look at how adventurous G-Shock is with form and with materials. It's for that reason. It's the same idea. You can have a $200 G-Shock or a $200,000 AP. That approach of giving that user a piece on their wrist that they can enjoy and experience from different angles and edges and lines, and it's the same sentiment that's there. It's the same idea that's there. That, I think, is when modern watchmaking is at its best, is when the maker approaches it as more than an object that tells time, but an object of sculpture, of artistry, of craft, of design, regardless of price point, regardless of what that means. On the production side, on the numbers that are produced, I'm talking about a design philosophy, not an end product. And that's what I really think a lot of back to high-end watchmaking, I think that's where Audemars Piguet, as well as many of the micro brands, the very small independent brands, are excelling at right now, is really pushing form language and design language in very exciting ways, and blurring that line between horology and art, which interestingly is the birth of horology. If we go all the way back to the early 16th century, those watches were not about function. They were terribly inaccurate. The sundial was more accurate. Those original works were about design aesthetics, showcasing rudimentary complications, chiming devices, alarm devices. They were experimental because it was a new form. So the birth of watches and where we're at today, interestingly, shares many, many themes, in the sense that they're liberated from convention, and the buyers of those objects, the Erics out there, are open to a wider range of approaches.
Look, my resounding memory from the last exploration of John Mayer's collection,
Yes,
was a concept. Is that gratifying to see? Because I suppose we're given a window on the way someone's collection develops over time. I thought that was really peculiar. That was the part that really jumped out to me, and that's my sort of singular memory of the last video. What's your reaction to seeing that kind of thing?
I want to pass this to Eric, because this is a great point that we haven't talked about yet. the eclipse between the vintage collector and the modern collector. 20 years ago, these were two different worlds. They were really, it was very rare to see someone passionate about vintage and passionate about modern. I think I'm gonna, Eric, why don't you take this over? Because you're one of those people. You were maybe one of those people really openly embracing both worlds simultaneously. And I think John also very much falls in that category of having deep passion and appreciation for not just the past, but also the present and future of watchmaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think collectors, you can go both ways. You can be a modern collector that somehow at some point embraces vintage watches, or it can be like the other way around. You're like a vintage guy that embraces modern. For myself, and I think for our guitar playing friend, like, he was more known, I guess, as like a collector of these vintage things. He did these series of like, Houdinki videos and whatnot. And, I can speak for myself here, but my love of certain modern watches was born out of like appreciation that I had of the many different types of vintage watches that I liked. There's something to be said, like, for example, when I go out, we were talking in the first video about the remaster, right? There's something more assuring about me putting that remaster on my wrist, running about my day, having some like fleeting glances of the watch to tell the time, appreciate it on my wrist. And there's something like a little different than wearing that versus like wearing one of the vintage ones. You have like a different feeling. It's like, unfortunately, most of these, they were like snapback cases. The watches are not really waterproof. Sometimes with vintage watches, you have a thing happen, you wash your hands and shoot, the crystal is fogged up or something. With a modern watch, these are things that you don't worry about. With the certain aspects of like collecting things, about like little details. Is the crystal original? Is it unpolished? Is the dial original? Is it refinished? These are all things that you don't even think about in a modern watch because it's just ready to go. You strap it on, it's ready to go, it's robust, and you don't think about it, So psychologically, these two things I think are quite different,
Oh yeah.
The concept isn't a modern watch. It's a futuristic watch. So there's more of a polarization between vintage and a concept than there is a vintage and a modern watch.
The aesthetic of the original concept. You look at like the box that it came in, that big like kind of metal tube that weighs like 40 pounds. Like, I think Michael's grabbing one right now.
Yeah, you spotted this when we were setting up. My colleagues happily placed this futuristic space capsule that housed the CW1, the first concept. Quite fun.
I mean, this aesthetic reminded me of 1997 Terminator 2. Like something like Arnold comes down like naked in this pod thing, or something's going on. Like, this is like this is science fiction of like the late 90s, early 2000s.
Well, guys, though, you just hit the nail on the head, Eric. I mean, the first limited edition Offshore was the full PVD end of days that Francois and Arnold made together. And that you're absolutely right on that. By the time, so that project is done in 99, we sell one of them, blah, blah, blah. This is 02. So literally AP is infused with this science fiction approach. If anyone who's spent time around here, it's not uncommon at AP, amidst these beautiful regulator clocks and heritage watches, to see some Star Wars, some Terminator. There is a strong sci-fi vibe that our CEO, that Francois, brings, and a lot of us also have big passion for, like so many other people in our generation, where science fiction and fantasy and these types of approaches are so important, because for long they were viewed as escapism. People didn't realize that these were metaphorical, that science fiction and fantasy has always been metaphorical, and the way to talk about real subjects and more meaningful subjects, yet in a fun and creative way. But yeah, absolutely, that's embraced there. That's funny that you mentioned that, because I don't know if you had recalled that that Arnold was very much part of the AP picture.
Yeah, the Arnold All-Star watches,
That all
the
came
end of
after,
days-
yeah.
yeah, when I was younger, like the end of days was like my grail. Like AP, it was just such a great the color combination.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the PVD technology of the time wasn't like the best, but I do remember my end of days. Like inside the warranty booklet, there was this tear out page that's like, "Hey, when you scratch it up, like here's a coupon to get like a recoating done or something." It was pretty funny. I remember all this stuff.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
I
That was around
remember
the first time.
the box for that watch. It was a half of an octagon, like cut in
Yes.
the middle, and then opening up like this way with the little screws on the side. It was
Very cool.
yeah. It always brings a smile to my eye when I see in some random like a television show or a movie like somebody wearing like an AP. And I
Oh, yeah.
remember the show just ended, I guess last season or 2 seasons ago, but I was obsessively watching this show on HBO called Ballers with The Rock. It was
Yeah.
about the NFL stuff or whatever. And I remember the last season, the Rock, Dwayne Johnson was wearing the purple frosted chrono, but it looked so tiny on his wrist. I mean, it was like this, but then I remember distinctly him wearing it in like multiple episodes. It was kind of interesting.
Indeed. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him yet, but I understand he has quite a close relationship with he's a known Audemars Piguet lover and friend of the company. He's someone I would love to meet. He seems like a really great guy, always really great energy, and he does those big watches. They look small in him. There was one event a while back where I had the honor of being in proximity to the king, Mr. LeBron James, and he was wearing a 39 millimeter open work Royal Oak. And it was stunning on his wrist because with his stature and size, it really felt like a vintage watch in that sense of the size and the scale. But it was so incredible to see because, yes, of course, he can wear very large and very more pronounced watches, but to see this elegant, thin, open work 39 millimeter on the wrist of one of the greatest sports talents of all time, I understood very differently. And of course, the conversation proceeded about that watch with him. But I remember that moment because it was a surprise and it was exciting. And he too, the appreciation and excitement as these people come into our world, meet the watchmaker, spend time at the bench, they really come to embrace the culture of AP in the same way that we look to dive into their worlds as well. That's something that, just to be clear, those relationships we have in the company, they're often talked about, but all of these relationships begin with shared passion, existing interest to dive into the world of Audemars Piguet, whether it's a new collector, whether it's somebody very discreet or somebody very, very famous. We're not interested in going towards people who might have an interest in what we do. Of course, we teach, we educate, we share, but when it comes to those types of relationships and partnerships, it's very genuine, and it starts from the product. It starts from the objects and from the watches themselves, and then how they're made and how they're created.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, let's keep diving because we've got 2 treats for Eric today.
Yes. The next one, before you pull up the picture, this next one we're really excited about because the one we showed you is beautiful, but it's an animation. It's a new version of an existing complication. What we're going to show you next is a brand new complication into the field of Audemars Piguet. And it's somewhat largely connected to the one on my wrist right now, which I'm just going to show up a little bit in detail for everyone. This was the Code 1159 open-worked tourbillon watch, which was one of the codes right out of the gates we really had immense success with. It has been a real galvanizing watch, and we've had to increase production unexpectedly on this piece. We're not going to overproduce it, so if you own one, don't worry. We're not going to make too many. We're going to eventually, of course, that watch will discontinue as well before too many are made, like all of our high complications. But what was interesting about that watch was the crossover with concept collectors, by the way. Of those first 50 that sold, we were quite taken aback with how many of our existing clients from concept gravitated towards that open work tourbillon. In other words, that there was an element of, let's say, contemporary, maybe even touching upon futurism that spoke to our concept collectors in a very real and meaningful way. Fortunately, we were developing other movements at the time, and we were able to push some of those projects even further. So the next watch is also in the Code family, also in the Tourbillon family, but it's the first time we've done self-winding tourbillon flyback chronograph. And it is really pushing those notions. Please, go for it, man.
Mission to share. All right, you ready, Eric?
Let's do it.
Boom.
There you go. There you go. So what we're looking at over here is Flying Tourbillon. You can see, you see no other visible elements, no bridge, no gears interfering on the Flying Tourbillon. You have these beautiful open worked bridges instead of a dial, and those aren't just decorative. Those are, as you can see, they're securing, the titanium ones are securing the subsidiary dials, and the black ones are securing the barrel at 12 o'clock and the tourbillon down at 6 o'clock. You have those blue elements again. You really see the finishing of the code. But here you see that notion of play of light to the absolute extreme. This watch has, if I remember, 468 components, everything meticulously hand finished, everything on display. This is a great project because the movement dictates the design of the watch. When this movement was underway, there was really, we really felt we were onto something special and different, bringing in all of those different elements. I learned quite recently, I asked one of our heads of R&D, Luca Raggi, a good friend in the company, I said, hey, why the Flyback chronograph? That took an extra bit of effort, additional parts. And it was actually the one we were just talking about, the 4401 caliber. He said, if our new general chronograph caliber has a flyback, we have to make sure that the tourbillon chronograph has a flyback as well. Our first tourbillon chronograph was made in 1999 on the Tradition de Excellence #1. It was a split-second tourbillon. And then we really don't dive into the tourbillon chrono until 2010. So we're 10 years into development of tourbillon chronographs. I brought the prototype with me as well. Renderings are great, but it's also, again, bear with me, I'm not on a very high-tech machine here, but you can really get a sense for the layers, the play of light over here. And this is where it differs from concept. Even though the front looks like it could very easily be on a concept, you can see the movement, while modern and while beautifully finished and open work bridges, it's still a traditional three-bridge movement in many senses. So this is, again, where we start to look at the codes within AP. You have the concept pushing the futurism to the extreme. The code is about the contemporary in terms of those aesthetics, but the movements maintain more traditional aesthetics, but not completely. This is getting particularly nerdy. It might be easier for you to see on the images, but I just want to hold it over here. If you look from what would be 12 o'clock on the watch down to 6 o'clock on the watch, we've aligned the reverse of the barrel, the tourbillon, and the column wheel in a direct line from top to bottom. We went through great lengths to do really an experimentation of symmetry on this watch. The whole idea was showcasing play of light, showcasing hand finishing, but also to experiment with symmetry. For the more geeky movement people there, you guys know the column wheel in a chronograph is usually in a very particular place on the chronograph. Relocating the column wheel and all the associated levers and gearwork for the mechanism isn't a simple process. So it really was a brand new movement for us from beginning to end in that sense. It's the first time we've consciously aligned those elements on the reverse to give that aesthetic experience throughout. So Flying Tourbillon, Flyback chronograph, self-winding, that was an insistence on Francois back in 2016 to the R&D teams. He said, I want a new generation of high complications, entirely hand finished, but I don't want them to be fragile. I don't want that reputation of fragility with complications on these creations. So they were challenged to create these automatic versions. You've seen the peripheral rotor on the concept, increasing shock resistancy, and then moving towards the Flying Tourbillon, which were by far the first to do it. Many brands do beautiful Flying Tourbillons. The difference, though, again, hand finishing, hand assembly, hand decoration. This watch alone In terms of time, just the decorations, it's 2 weeks of work for one watchmaker just on the movement, not including the case on that watch. And these, again, the beauty of these pieces are embracing the different elements of watchmaking today, hand finishing, as well as the more technical elements required from the engineers and the technicians. What do you think on that one, Eric?
No pressure.
No pressure.
I love the complication, the way it looks, the skeletonized bridges and everything, and I think the movement design works really well in this code case. You know, I know that when the Code family debuted, there was a lot of banter online about the design. And, you know, it's just a new design. I mean, people don't love things necessarily right away. I happen to quite like it. You know, I like a lot of the different executions. And as you know, recently, I was able to look at in my hands the new Code watches with like the kind of degradé, the Vignette dials. And, you know, they were fantastic, especially the ones, you know, when you have the lugs in one color and then the case middle kind of in another color. You know, like two-tone is not the sexiest kind of thing, but the way that you guys have done it with the remaster and with those Code watches, it's like a really beautiful execution, you know? And this kind of like carries in that tradition. I think the one that is on your wrist, the skeletonized tourbillon, I always thought was really great. I got a lot of close time with that unique one that you guys made for Only Watch last November, which obviously it did very well. And, you know, this is like a nice continuation of that, you know, and I like the idea of these complicated movements that are automatic as opposed to manual winding, that adds that more kind of robustness to it, and that more the ability to kind of like it's a more livable watch, if you will, you know. So.
Exactly. It's that idea that it's the same solution that had to be solved in the 70s for dress watches, which is why the luxury sports watch was created in the first place at AP, and then as well other companies, is people didn't want to have to take off their watch when they wash their hands, when they go out for a run. They wanted to keep the object on. And now complication owners are arriving there as well. Again, the demographic has gotten very wide. We sell complications to people ranging from age 20 to 70 on a fairly consistent basis. And the market for high complications at Audemars Piguet, as well as at a couple other companies, is growing. It's getting bigger in terms of the demand, which is challenging for us because obviously we have capacity issues. With the hand finishing, we could only make X number of perpetuals, X number of tourbillons, X number of repeaters. And every time you introduce a new model, that means less of something else. You know, so if anyone's curious about why some of these APs are hard to get, it's not a business choice to produce less. It's a reality of the fact that capacity is what it is. We're working to train more watchmakers, but when these elements are all hand finished, we don't want to cut corners, we don't want to rush, and we don't want to take the methods that are not central to what we do. So even looking at Perpetual, just jumping to Perpetual for a second, in the last 12 months, we have the Code Perpetual, stainless steel, with blue dial, rose gold, white ceramic, black ceramic skeleton, as well as market editions like the China edition and others. So call it 10 models. You can imagine we have not so many Perpetual watches being produced every year. So I can't tell you the exact number. I can tell you it's well below 1,500 though total. So you take that number and you divide it by those 10, and you start to realize why there are so few of these watches out there. We would like to make more. We hope we'll be able to increase production. We're working on it. Never to overproduce, but to be able to at least start to satisfy a little bit more. But if you're out there waiting for one of these watches, it's not an excuse. It's just an explanation that capacity is very, very real. We're not choosing to make only, this one I just showed you is only going to be 50 pieces, and they'll be pre-sold before, they won't hit the store. Our top clients will be seeing an avant premiere. They already are. Each market will have only a couple. They'll be placed we'll talk about it, we'll promote it, but it will be a story at that point, because these watches will largely already be in the hands of collectors when you only have 50 of an object like this. So I just wanted to address that point as well, Andrew, and you, Eric, as well, because Eric, you're waiting on a couple things as well. I mean, even, this is, no client can, it's tough. It's really tough. But there is a good understanding there that it is really a matter of capacity. And when this crisis settles, and when you're able to come visit Audemars Piguet and you see the manufacturer, you visit here in Le Brassus, you start to understand how these things are made and why there are inherent limitations. And keep in mind, this connects to the 2120 as well. Why are there so few Royal Oak 15202s? That's the base movement for the Perpetual. So there is an interconnection here. We're working on it. But it's going to take a little bit of time.
I was going to say, when the museum opens, I'm going to bring my remaster and hand it to you, and you can hand it back to me as I threshold into the museum.
So Andrew, just so you know, and Eric, Eric kind of knew already, the initial plan was, a few years ago, we invited into the museum really the world's most, let's say, passionate and expert vintage AP collectors and enthusiasts and industry to have a dinner inside the museum with Jasmine Audemars and Olivier Audemars present. We wanted them to meet the people who are acquiring the vintage APs, who are passionate about that side of the story. And the goal was, with Remaster, was to bring that group back, as well as some of our new collectors, for an event here to launch Remaster, to bring together those experts in the vintage community and those passionate collectors of our modern watches into one space, and really have a fun dialogue about these different topics. Of course, Eric was on my top line for the panel for that, as well as a couple of our other mutual friends. Needless to say, it didn't happen. But as Eric said, maybe one day we'll recreate something along those lines after the fact. But this discussion we're having about remastering the past, about looking back, looking forward, there's a lot more we can dive into and discuss on those topics.
I feel like that's a really nice natural closure to what's been an incredibly enlivened and interesting discussion for me to be a part of. Gentlemen, I thank you so much for your time, and what a day, huh?
Yes.
I appreciate your guys' time as well, and everyone listening. And it's as mentioned before, these discussions shining light back on the watchmakers. This is the pursuit, and thank both of you guys tremendously for your passions, your work, your contributions to this great and expanding field of horology. And I'm really happy to know that both of you guys are just a FaceTime, Skype, Zoom, you call it, just a click away, and hopefully sooner than later, we're back in the IRL all together, and that will be a moment to celebrate.
Yes.